Good morning, Old Testament survey students. This is Mr. Albers, and we are going to be looking at the continued adventures of Elijah and Ahab. So we're picking up where yesterday you left off with the great showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal or Baal on Mount Carmel. So you should have filled out questions 11, 12, and 13 in your guided notes yesterday. And now we're going to pick up immediately after that story. So you recall, Elijah has called down fire from heaven, proving publicly that Yahweh is God. All of the people, including the king Ahab, fall down and are proclaiming Yahweh is God, Yahweh is God. They slaughter the prophets of Baal, and Elijah prays, and there is rain that breaks the drought that has been going on for over 3 years. So it's a great moment. It's a moment where it looks like a national revival is about to break out. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that that's what Elijah is expecting to happen. And you can imagine, like, he's been on the run for years. He's been fed by ravens. He's been fed by a poor foreign widow that had nothing. He's had all this time. He's struggled with Ahab. He has won. God has vindicated him. He's probably thinking, this is the moment that I've been working my whole life towards. And yet, that's not what happens. So at this point, we're going to pause the video and y'all will read 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 8 together in class and talk about what happened, and specifically answer number 14. What is Jezebel's response to Elijah's actions? And then when you're done, resume the video, and then we'll go over that. Okay, so Jezebel, unlike Ahab, is not thrilled when she gets the word of what Elijah has done. And this is kind of as an aside, this is the first of many instances where we see that she is the one who is really the power behind the throne, that Ahab never really is able to stand up to her in any way, shape, or form. And so she sends a message to Elijah and basically says, calls down a curse upon herself and says, may the gods strike me dead. May they slaughter me like you slaughtered those priests, if I don't make you like them by this time tomorrow. So translation, Elijah, if I don't kill you in the next 24 hours, may the gods strike me down. And so Elijah heads for the hills, and he runs. And he runs out of the north. He runs all the way into the southern kingdom. He gets to Beersheba, which is about the southernmost tip of the nation of Judah. So he doesn't just cross the border, he goes all the way to the other side of the southern kingdom. He dismisses his servant, and then he keeps going south into the wilderness, into the desert. He collapses and he asks to die, basically. He says, Lord, I'm done. I don't have anything left. In fact, it's really interesting. His wording is almost identical to what Jonah will say a couple hundred years later. The irony is Elijah is asking to die because he has striven to turn the people back to God, and they haven't. He feels like he's failed, and so he's ready to die. Jonah is like the anti-Elijah. Jonah wants to die because he has preached a message of mercy to the Ninevites, and they've accepted it, and God has been merciful to them. And so Jonah is mad that his mission has succeeded, whereas Elijah is depressed that his mission has failed. And so, as he's sitting there, as he's lying there, ready to give up, God sends an angel and gives him food and says, eat. And so he eats, and he sleeps, and he takes a nap. And it's really interesting. I think this teaches us sometimes when we are depressed, or when a friend is depressed, the best thing that can happen is to just take care of our body, to eat, or to drink, or to take a nap. Sometimes that's the most spiritual thing we can do, the most helpful thing we can do. It may not necessarily be, all right, we need to spend 3 hours in prayer. It may be he's exhausted. He just needs to sleep. He needs to eat. And he does. And God in his kindness gives him exactly what he needs. And so Elijah sleeps. He eats the food that God provides, that God sends an angel to give to him. And then he continues on into the wilderness for 40 days. And he comes to Mount Horeb, which is Mount Sinai. Same mountain, different name. You know it as the place where God gave the law, especially the 10 Commandments. All right, so he gets here, and at this point, pause the video again. Go ahead and read 1 Kings 9, or 19 rather, so same chapter, verses 9 through 12. And then unpause the video, we'll talk about that, and then we'll continue on through this passage, a very significant passage. All right. So, God comes to Elijah as Elijah gets to Mount Sinai. Presumably, Elijah wants to meet with God, right? Why else would he be heading to the mountain where God had historically revealed himself to the people of Israel? So Elijah gets there, and he goes into this cave. And God comes to speak to Elijah, but it's very interesting how this happens, right? God comes, but not in a strong wind. There's a wind that buffets the mountain. Elijah's hiding in this cave, but we read that God's not in the strong wind. Then there's an earthquake that shakes the ground, but God is not in the earthquake. Then there's a fire, so whether that's lightning or whether that's like fire flashing around, we're not told, but God's not in the fire. And finally, there's like the voice of a gentle blowing or a gentle whisper. And when Elijah hears that, that's when he comes out. And the late Henry Halley, the one who, if you ever read Halley's Bible Handbook, the primary author of that, he says about this passage, it seems as if God was telling Elijah that while force and spectacular demonstrations of power are sometimes necessary, think about Elijah's background, right? He's just come from God making a big spectacle in public, right? Fire from heaven in the sight of all the people. But sometimes, Halley goes on to say, God's real work in the world is not always accomplished by such methods. Sometimes God's ways are more like a gentle whisper. And so while Elijah got to see the big spectacle, the fire, that's not necessarily the way that God brings revival all the time. All right, as we continue in the passage, go ahead and pause the video yet once more and read verses 13 and 14 out loud, and then talk about the answer to number 15. We're looking at what is Elijah's complaint, and it's mentioned twice. Verse 13 is the second time, 13 and 14 rather. And then we're going to look at how Yahweh responds on the next slides. The first part of question 15, read verses 13 and 14 of 1 Kings 19, and then resume, and we'll talk through them. All right. First thing to point out is that the Lord calls to Elijah. And this reminds me a little bit of the Garden of Eden. After Adam and Eve had sinned and they heard the sound of God coming and they hid themselves, and God called out to Adam, "Where are you?" Not because God didn't know, right? I mean, same thing here, right? God knows very well why Elijah has run. But God's not saying this because he needs information. God is inviting Elijah to come and unburden his soul, so to speak, just as God invited Adam in the garden to come out and to come clean. It's the first step of healing, we might say. And so God's summoning of Elijah maybe is a little bit intimidating after the earthquake and the wind and the fire, but remember that God's coming to him in a gentle whisper. And so God is being tender. He's being patient. He's being kind and compassionate to Elijah. And so he asks, Elijah, what are you doing here? And then Elijah kind of lets it out, right? And he says, I have been very jealous or zealous for Yahweh, the God of hosts. The people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They've thrown down your altars. They've killed all your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only am left, and now they seek to kill me. Now, is all of that true? Not entirely. We've read, if you remember from earlier chapters, there's a man named Obadiah who had hid many prophets of the Lord in caves. He hid 100 prophets. Elijah's not the only literal person who still worships Yahweh in the northern kingdom, but he sure feels like it, right? And if you've ever been depressed or down in the dumps for whatever reason, there are times when we genuinely feel like we're all alone, or that we're the only one, or we might as well be the only one who's experiencing the feelings, the circumstances, the trials that we're going through. And so Elijah feels this way too. And God invites him to share this gently. He invites Elijah and he invites us to speak honestly about what's going on. Does this mean that when Elijah vents that he's not sinning in any way? No, right? He's not seeing things as well. He does need some correction, but he also needs somebody to listen. And God is more than willing to do that. And Elijah's raw honesty, while not perfect, was the first step that he needed to take in order to start to be healed, to be restored. The Psalms give us great examples of this similar type of attitude, whether from David or from other psalmists, pouring out their raw, honest emotion before God, because God invites us to do that. He's big enough to take it. Doesn't mean that it's totally okay to have attitudes where we feel like God has abandoned us. I mean, obviously God hasn't, but it does mean that when we're feeling that way, the best thing that we can do is to be honest about it and then let God start to go to work on it. So Elijah's complaint is more or less like, I've tried, I've given all of this, it's not working, I'm the only one left and they're coming to kill me. So, one more time, pause the video, go ahead and read verses 15 through 18, which will take us to the end of this passage. Look at what the Lord, or how the Lord responds, talk about that briefly, and then you can unpause the video and we'll go through that. All right, so in essence, the Lord's response is to send Elijah back. I think of a coach, right? When a player makes a mistake, whether they miss a spike or they miss a dig or they drop the ball or fumble the ball or they let the ball's hit and it goes between their legs, and the coach, rather than just sitting him on the bench, sends the player right back in and says, I still believe in you. You still have work to do. Go get them again. And I think this is what God's doing, right? Elijah's more or less asking to be taken out. I mean, he's asked to just for God to take his life earlier in the chapter, right? And so Elijah's ready to be done. And God could very well have said, okay, you want out? I'll find somebody else. It's not a problem for me. Sometimes the worst thing that God can do is to give us exactly what we ask for. But God is better than that, and he's kinder than that. And he sends Elijah back. And he says, Elijah, I still have work for you to do. You haven't failed. There's still things that you can do to accomplish my purpose. And he says, you're going to go back, and I want you to anoint or select 3 people. I'm going to call these the 3 Avengers. We'll talk more about them in coming weeks. But a guy named Hazael, who's a Gentile, who's going to be the future king of Syria, or Aram, depending on your translation of the Bible. Just as kind of a heads up here, Aram or the Arameans, Syria, the Syrians. That's the same thing in this part of the Old Testament. He's going to anoint Hazael. He's going to anoint Jehu, who will be the future king of Israel. That's the northern kingdom. And he's going to anoint Elisha, who will be the next prophet. And God says these ones will avenge the blood that has been shed because of Baal. They will be my instruments of judgment. And specifically, I want you to remember this phrase: the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. We'll see that play out in a really specific way here in a few lessons. And then notice what God says at the end. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. And so at the end, God says, and by the way, Elijah, it's not just you. It's not just you. I still have 7,000 people that are faithful. You may not see them right now. You may not feel that they're there. They may have to keep their heads down because of the wickedness of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. But you're not the only one. There are more. It's not just you. And I think this passage is just overall a beautiful picture of how God deals with somebody who is struggling, who's been trying to honor God, who we would say has been greatly successful but isn't seeing the results that he wants to see and is really broken by it. And God meets with Elijah, listens to him, is compassionate, and then sends him back and says, I'm not done with you yet. You still have more to do for my kingdom. I think that's pretty cool. All right. Well, for the sake of time, that's probably going to be all of the reading together that we're going to do. But we will sum up what happens with Naboth's vineyard. This is question number 16. So, in a nutshell, we're back with Ahab. Ahab sees this vineyard that is nearby to his palace, and he wants it, but it belongs to somebody else named Naboth. And so he goes to Naboth and says, hey, can I buy your vineyard? I'll pay you whatever it's worth. Or if you'd like, I'll give you a better vineyard in exchange. And Naboth says, the Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. And I don't think this is just Naboth saying, I like this vineyard, I don't really want to sell. I mean, he's saying no to the king. I think we're meant to read this as Naboth is remembering way back when God gave the people the land, that this was the little portion of land that Naboth's family got. So this was his share of God's promise to Abraham. So it's not just, I kind of like this vineyard, it does pretty well, I don't want to sell it. This is my connection to God's promise, like this specific piece of land. I don't want to sell this. And so Ahab, being the great powerful king he is, goes home and goes to bed and stops eating and pouts, throws a big fit. And it's meant to be, I think, as funny as the text makes it. And so Jezebel, his wife, notices he's not eating. She's like, so what's going on with you? Why aren't you eating? And he says, well, I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, give me your vineyard for money or I'll give you another vineyard. And he told me he wouldn't do it. And again, this is the king pouting. So Jezebel said, aren't you the king of Israel? Like, get up, go eat. Be cheerful. I'll get you, I'll take care of this. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth. And Jezebel, who's cold-blooded, got ice in her veins, proceeds to sit down, write a letter to the leaders of Naboth's town, basically arranging for him to be falsely accused in public of blaspheming God so that he can be stoned by an angry mob. And Jezebel is crafty. She even writes in the letter, make sure you have 2 people make this claim. Why? Because she doesn't care a whit for honoring God, but she knows enough of her Old Testament law to know that you can't have someone executed without at least 2 witnesses. And so she sets it up to where she's got 2 people that have been paid off that are willing to stand up in public and lie about Naboth, and the plan goes seemingly without a hitch. Naboth is dragged out by an angry mob who believes falsely that he has cursed God and cursed the king. He's stoned to death, and so all of a sudden his vineyard is now free for Ahab to take possession of it. Okay? It's tragic, it's messed up, there's some humor in there. it's just, I mean, this is Ahab and Jezebel in a nutshell. I said it went off almost without a hitch. Well, at first it seems like that, but obviously God is not blind to what's happening here. And so God sends Elijah, and as Ahab is rolling in with his troops to the vineyard to take possession of it, who should show up but Elijah himself? And Elijah pronounces God's judgment, right? God knows exactly what Ahab's did. And he says, "Thus says the Lord, in the place where the dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, dogs will lick up your own blood." He goes on to say, "Every male in your house will die." So this is essentially a repeat. You've seen that this curse came upon Jeroboam's house and was fulfilled by Baasha, and then Baasha was so bad that the curse was put upon his house as well, and now Ahab has earned that too, right? God is going to avenge the innocent blood of Naboth. And Elijah says, by the way, Jezebel is going to be eaten by dogs. Okay. Gruesome end, right, for a very wicked woman. And in response, and this is fascinating, Ahab humbles himself. And he puts on sackcloth and goes around fasting and mourning. And God comes to Elijah and says, "You see how Ahab has humbled himself? I will postpone the judgment until after he is dead." And again, this is fascinating, right? Why would God do that? Because we're going to see in the next chapter, there's no evidence that like Ahab really ever shows great fruit of this repentance. There's no evidence that he gives up his claim to the vineyard. There's no evidence that he's doing anything more than just being sorry that he got caught and that there's this terrible judgment upon him. But God, in his mercy, decides to grant mercy anyway. Sometimes God does that just because he can. And that can be bothersome, right? Depending on who God does that to. It's very easy to read this passage and say, well, why on earth? Like, Ahab doesn't deserve murder. Like, he's clearly faking. He's just mad that he's getting punished. Why, oh why? Maybe it reminds you of the story of Cain and Abel, right? Cain's not sorry. Cain's just sorry that he got caught. Cain's whining about his punishment. Lord, why don't you just strike him dead? Like, you exile him, but he immediately goes off, and instead of wandering, builds a city. He has no intention of turning back to you. Why do you do this? Because God is merciful and gracious, and he's slow to anger, and he's abounding in steadfast love. And sometimes God just shows mercy because he can. And I think that's one of these times. Ahab doesn't deserve it. Nobody ever deserves it, but Ahab especially doesn't deserve it. And yet, God relents. And I think it's a powerful picture of who our God is. However, shortly thereafter, in fact, in the very next chapter, Ahab is back to his wicked ways. And this is going to be a very short version of number 18, which is from 1 Kings 22. I highly recommend you read this passage on your own. I haven't assigned it or anything like that, but it's a very fascinating story on many different levels. It's got humor, it's got intrigue, it's got battle. And it has the demise of Ahab. Spoiler warning. So Ahab basically decides that he wants to go and reclaim the city of Ramoth Gilead, from Syria, or from Aram, the bordering nation in the northeast of Israel. And so he calls together his friend Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah. They're actually pretty close. Jehoshaphat, we find out later, is a God-fearing king who does a lot of good things, but tends to be too quick to get buddy-buddy with evil kings from the north. Regardless, Ahab says, Jehoshaphat, can we go to battle together? Jehoshaphat says, okay, but do you have any prophets that we can ask first if this is a good idea? And Ahab says, oh yeah, I got lots of prophets. And so he has his prophets who are clearly not from the Lord. They're just false prophets who tell him whatever he wants to hear. And they all come by and say, yes, go out, attack. You will win. Everything you do will succeed. And Jehoshaphat says, is there a prophet of Yahweh here that we can ask? And Ahab says, well, there's one named Micaiah, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good concerning me, but only evil. So basically, that guy never says anything good about me. So like, why would we ask him? And Jehoshaphat says, let's call him. So they call in Micaiah, and Micaiah, sure enough, prophesies that Ahab is going to die in battle. In fact, Micaiah specifically says, you know what? I was given a vision of what was going on in heaven, and God allowed a deceiving spirit, so either Satan or one of his minions, to go and to fill the mouths of, Ahab, your lackey prophets. And so that's specifically so that you listen to them, you go into battle, so that you die, which will be God's judgment on you. And Ahab says, lock him up. I'll deal with him when I get back. And Micaiah says, you're not coming back. If you ever come back, you'll know God hasn't spoken through me. So Ahab goes into battle nonetheless, but he decides he's going to try to duck under the judgment by disguising himself. And he convinces Jehoshaphat that it would be a good idea for Jehoshaphat to dress like a king and for Ahab to dress like an ordinary soldier. And Jehoshaphat, in many ways, a great guy, lots of good stories we'll get to when we cover him, but seems to maybe not have had as much of a backbone sometimes as he should have, and he agrees to this plan. So Jehoshaphat goes into battle. The Syrians think that he's Ahab. They go after him, and as they're about to catch him, they notice that's not Ahab, that's Jehoshaphat, and so they turn back and they leave him alone. So God is looking out for his follower. Meanwhile, an archer, quote unquote, at random, draws his bow, fires, and just so happens, again, quote unquote, to hit Ahab in the crease of his armor. So Ahab has to be wheeled out of the battle, and slowly he bleeds to death in his chariot. They take him back to Samaria, and wouldn't you know it, like the blood flows down and is licked up by dogs in the same place where they licked up Naboth's blood all those years earlier, thus fulfilling the prophecy of the Lord by Elijah. In fact, we read, the dogs licked up his blood according to the word of the Lord that Elijah had spoken. And thus endeth Ahab, one of the most wicked, if not the most wicked king that Israel ever had. And that's the answer to both parts of number 18. And that brings our lesson on the further adventures of Elijah and Ahab to a close.